Ready. Ready to begin. So welcome everybody. What we're going to be going over today are the deal analyzer tools that I have. You're all welcome to use them. And if you want any help on your deals, I'm here. Let me get into the, I'm going to share my screen and then also share the actual, what do you call it? The actual links to the drives. Hello, Jay. Nice to see you. And Jay, we have this every week on Thursday. Unless it's the week of the elephant challenge, we have it every other week besides that. So it's on Thursdays, 8 p.m. Hold on. This is a deal that I'm in the middle of. Give me a minute here. Hello. All right. Sorry about that, but can't let a deal slip through the cracks, right? So, been negotiating with him, and just my partner went down to see the property, and we came to an agreed upon price. And tonight, after this class, I'll be putting out the PSA and make it a done deal.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Of course, it's not a done deal until you actually close, right?
Exactly.
Don't count your chickens until they hatch. I'm already counting them though. All right. Let me share my screen here. Everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So let me get the share link. And I'll post that here in the chat. Right on. So it's in the chat. Anybody wants to hop on? The way that you use this, number one, is that you have to go into File, Make a Copy. Quite frequently, people will ask, can you give me edit rights? I cannot give anybody edit rights because if people are editing it, they're going to mess it up. So what you want to do is come in, File, Make a Copy, make your own copy, name it with the address, or if it's a portfolio, something to indicate what that portfolio is about. And then you can put in here everything relative to that address or that portfolio. Put in all your notes as you work through this, the whole thing, so that you can come back and look at your notes. You know, the notes might have like follow-up tasks. I need to go find out what the cap rate is for this area. I need to talk to the realtor, or whatever it is that you have for tasks. I put room for notes under each section. So as you work your way down section by section, you can put your notes in here and keep track of the information you gathered, and any details you still need to follow up on. So this is primarily a multi-family deal analyzer. I do have tabs in here for a single family creative and a single family flip. However, these I found are, I'm redoing them. To the single families, I'm redoing them to make them more intuitive, not so complex. I'll show you right now where I'm at on that. So very shortly, I'll have that one done and available for whoever wants to use it. Oh, it's right here. Yeah. So this one is the single family creative. Basically, you have up here your entrance. I'm going to reorganize this a little bit, but you know what it takes to go, your ARV, your purchase price, whatever repairs you have, you put in your square feet here and your dollar per square foot to rehab it, you know, your acquisition costs. In the end, you have a cost basis of what you have in the deal after your financing. So you can choose if the financing is going to be interest only, like hard money, or if it's going to be amortized, and then you set everything accordingly. I'm going to make this more smooth and intuitive, this section here. But then you have 4 exits in this, potential exits. So exit 1 is a flip. Exit 2 is a rental of some sort, long-term, mid-term, or short-term. Exit 3 is a lease option. Exit 4 is a seller finance. So I'll be fine-tuning this and making it ready for everybody within the next week. But I like this one better than the single family creative that's on the main spreadsheet. So after I get this fine-tuned, I'm actually going to swap out in this one, the single family creative tab with that. It's going to be, it just flows better, I think. So you got, you know, at the top you have your entrance, and I might create like multiple entrances. And then after that, multiple exits, so that you can see what's the best entrance and what's the best exit for any particular property. So that's in the works. Let me see what we got here.
I got a question.
Yeah.
I see an awful lot of the tabs, or a lot of the information sections went away. So, you know, like the first thing I see on the income is like the Zillow rent comp and Hotpad's rent comp and all that kind of stuff. So where will that information go on your new spreadsheet, on the new version?
Man, you're quick. I was just like scrolling through it fast, and you notice what's missing and what's there. Pretty impressive. I don't know yet. I might include some of that, and I might not include some of that. Like this one is very detailed. Oh, link to the earlier sections. So Jay, I'm gonna put on here a link for the YouTube. All the earlier sections, I post them into the YouTube channel. So you can go watch all of the earlier sessions there in YouTube. Okay. And Jay, if you could just message everybody instead of direct message, that way, because anytime you message me, then if I try to type something in, it's gonna only send it to you instead of to everybody when I want to send it to everybody. It's helpful. Unless it's really private, just send it to everybody. If there is something private, like an address or, you know, something like that you don't want to share, that's fine. But yeah, so good question there, Jim. I'll be following up on that. I don't know exactly yet. It's still in the works, but I really like the flow of, in particular, of the 4 exits, so you can see side by side how good each one is compared to the other. But will it have all the details of this? I don't think it needs all the details when you're dealing with single family homes. Will you need Zillow and Hotpad rent comps? Yeah, that's good to have, definitely. So, you know, you do privy comps for when you're dealing with rent. Rent is different than a flip, right? So Zillow and Hotpads are great for rent comps. I like privy personally for ARV comps, but there's other tools you can use for comping as well. So whatever works for you. But there will be details here that are just not really necessary for a single family, or it can be summarized really easy and not be broken out so completely. So good catch, Jim. We'll see. All right, so the first section here is basically the details of the property. This is built for multifamily. It can work for a duplex, triplex, quadruplex, or bigger, but it's really built for like commercial multifamily. Commercial is 5 doors and up, right? 5 units and up. It will work on smaller. When you get into the smaller, comps play a bigger role. So duplex, you want to look at what duplexes are selling for in the area, right? It's not just income. When you get into the residential multifamily as opposed to commercial multifamily, the actual comps, duplex, triplex, quadruplex comps play a bigger role than they do in the commercial side. So just keep that in mind. They both play a role, the comps as well as the the rent comps. But you just weigh it heavier depending on what you're doing, commercial or residential. Pardon me. Sorry about that. So you want to, this has formulas in the background. There's hidden tabs. So if you go over here and you look at hidden views, there's tabs back there that have formulas that I didn't want to cloud up the main sheet. But when you select, for example, the age of the complex, these are different eras, generations, build generations. So depending on the build generation, it'll change how it calculates the maintenance and repairs, M&R, as well as the cap rate. I'm sorry, CapEx. So obviously an older building is going to require more maintenance and capital expense than a newer building, right? So that's why all these details, you want to fill them out because they can affect things in the background and then adjust your maintenance and repairs, which is right here, as well as your capital expenses, which is down here, right? So just keep that in mind. Try to fill this out as thoroughly as you can. The generation, the seller price, which is reflected down here in seller price again, and the cap rate. The cap rate is basically how multifamilies, what price multifamilies are trading at. So, if you have a certain area and a certain class of multifamily, I'm sorry, let me go to multifamily here. Then it's going to be a particular cap rate for that area and for that class. So if it's a class A neighborhood, I'm going to put this asset class to A. You'll see the cap rate changes to 4. If it's a class B, it changes to 6. A class C, it changes to 8. Now that's just like a national average. That doesn't mean it's going to be that case in your market. So if you're in Memphis and you're in Dallas, it's way different. Every market is different. You got to know your market. And you can talk to realtors. They can tell you what the cap rate is for your area. And that cap rate is a way of calculating the value of your multifamily complex. So the value is calculated as the NOI divided by the cap rate. And that gives you your valuation. You can also do it the other way. You can say that cap rate is calculated as your NOI divided by your valuation. I don't like to look at it that way. You can, but I like to look at it the other way to figure out the evaluation. If you know the cap and you know your NOI, you can figure out the valuation. That's like one of the main ways that people evaluate properties is NOI divided by cap. So just keep that in mind. How do you determine the asset class? So asset class, number one, you're going to get a feel over time, but basically a class A is going to have high-end amenities. It might have a spa, it might have a pool, it might have other, high-end amenities. You might have like the countertops are going to be stone. It's at the high-end level. A Class A is typically going to be in your $1 million house neighborhood. Okay. It's not going to be in a slum neighborhood. You're not going to have a Class A apartment in a bad neighborhood. So that will help you determine both the neighborhood as well as how the apartments are built. If you're looking at a house, you have like rental grade stuff, builder grade stuff, and then you have, custom grade stuff, right? So a Class A is going to be custom grade finishes typically. Class B is kind of like your middle class apartments, they're called garden apartments, right? Which is probably a good share of all the apartments that are built nowadays are garden style apartments. Those are typically Class B. The Class C are going to be your budget type apartments. They're typically like blocks of apartments together. The grade of all the materials is lower end. The neighborhood is also lower end. It's not going to be, typically there's Class A, B, and C. Some people count Class D. I count a Class D because there's a separation in my mind. A realtor will never promote it as a D because they can't sell anything as a D, right? Why are they going to promote it as something they can't sell? But a D is basically the drug neighborhood where you want to stay out of. People are getting killed. That's the type of neighborhood that's really hard to have a property because you just never know what's going to happen. People don't want to live there. You have a high turnover rate. So I don't suggest getting a Class D. I hope that helps spell it out a little bit, how you know the asset class. But all of these kind of build up to what the asset class is. You have your neighborhood class, which may or may not match the actual property, right? So you can have a higher end neighborhood, but the property isn't as high end as the neighborhood. That's a good find because you can always upgrade the property, but you can't realistically upgrade the neighborhood unless you buy the whole neighborhood, right? So you want to find, you never get a property that's above the neighborhood, but you can get a property that's below the neighborhood. The condition of the property, is it well maintained? Is it kind of, falling apart? That makes a difference in the class as well. And then the tenants, are the tenants the type of tenants that, there's loud, everyone's loud at night and people are complaining and, dogs barking all the time. The type of tenant will also make a difference in the class. So you take a look at all those factors, and after all those factors, you decide, okay, what is this? Is it an A, B, C, or somewhere in between? You pick the right one, and it's going to automatically select your cap rate. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to stick with that cap rate. If you know your cap rate is different because you talked to a realtor, because you know your stuff, you know your neighborhood, just change it. So like instead of 8, let's say that it was going to be a 7.25. That's the cap for my neighborhood. Just change it to 7.25, right? And so these formulas are meant to be overridden. You can override them anytime you need to make it more accurate. It's just an aid to help you along the path. It's not a law. The GRM is basically gross. What is it? I always forget this. GRM, gross. Yeah, I forget. Anyway, what it is it's a multiplier. Gross rent multiplier. There you are. A gross rent multiplier basically takes your rent, your effective, is it the effective? I think it's the, let me see here. Yeah, okay, so it's the entire gross rent. And it takes that and it multiplies it by this number, which is 8 by the multiplier. And that's another way of evaluating it. So you'll find properties that evaluate it on a cap, or they'll tell you it's an 8 cap, they'll tell you it's an 8 GRM. If you come across that GRM and you don't know what it means, that's what it means. That means that your property is priced. If you find it advertised at an 8%, or you find it advertised at an 8 GRM, that just helps you to see how they evaluated the property, how they priced the property. So that's there for you. And down here under the actual valuations, you have a GRM evaluation and you have an NOI over cap evaluation. All right, let me see what we got here. Oh yeah, thank you, Jay. Gross rent multiplier, yep. So many acronyms, it's hard to keep track of them all. Okay, so next section, once you go through this first section and fill out the details, now you come down to the income and operating expenses. So on the income side, you don't have to fill out all of this stuff. You can work your way down. But if you know already some of the lower items on this list, everything above it, you don't necessarily have to pay attention to. So there's vacancy loss, there's collection loss, there's concessions, there's non-revenue. So when you're dealing with large multifamily, they might have some units set aside for another purpose. Maybe they're using the units for storage. That's a non-revenue unit, right? So you want to know what's going on with these different units. And whenever you're looking at a property, you should walk every unit and make sure of its condition and what's going on. Don't just count off of the offer memorandum or whatever they're advertising, whatever they told you over the phone. When it comes down, you can put your LOI in beforehand with fill this out, get your details, figure out your offer. But in the end, you have to walk every unit so you can see what's happening in every unit. Are they rent ready? Or are they not? Concessions is basically what they use to draw people in. So like giving, first month's rent half price or something like that is a concession. You may or may not have concessions. So that number's there in case, you can look at what they were doing. You can ask them how they're doing their marketing, how they're getting their apartments filled. Some people use concessions, some people don't. If you have a low inventory of apartments, you won't need to use concessions. Collection loss, you're going to see more collection loss in your lower end classes. So a D class, especially, but then a C class perhaps. So that's there, it's real. The higher end tenants like class A, class B, you probably won't have a collection loss. Vacancy, the ideal vacancy is typically 5%. If your vacancy rate is too low, it means your prices are too high or it's bad management, something like that. If your vacancy is 100%, if you have a 100% vacancy, I'm sorry, let me put a 0% vacancy, 100% filled, it might mean that the prices are simply too low and you're leaving money on the table. And that's why it's always full, is because you're just priced too low. So the 95% or 5% vacancy is a good target where your pricing is right. So long as you're managing it right, that's a good place to try to shoot for. Jay, I don't know if you heard the GRM, gross rent multiplier, that's just a way of evaluating the property and telling you how they evaluated it. So if you get an offer memorandum or they advertise on LoopNet or somewhere what the GRM is, it's a way of telling you, how they evaluated the property. So if you notice as a C class, the GRM is 8. If I change it to an A class, the GRM is 12. So that multiplier goes up. So it's the rent times the multiplier gives you the value of the property. Whereas the cap rate is the opposite. As you go a higher class rate, the cap rate goes down. But that's just a way of evaluating the property. If you see the GRM, that's what it's for. You take the gross rents and you multiply it by the GRM, and that tells you the valuation of the property. I don't particularly use the GRM much but it's there, and some people use it. So if you see an offering with it in there, that's how you use it. It's just it's an indicator of how they price the property. The higher the GRM, it tells you that the property is basically they evaluated it higher, right? So they said it's worth a lot. If it's worth so much, it better be a high-end property to be worth so much. Hope that answers the question there. Okay, so back on the income. So once you take out all of these losses, you have your gross income, gross rent income, and then you take out all these different losses and you come to an effective rental income. So that effective rental income is like the real rental income after the subtraction of vacancies and all. And by the way, if somebody says that they have 100% occupancy rate, don't believe it. It's probably not true unless you get like a T36 where you can verify that it was filled 100% of the time for multiple years in a row, because it's rare that you'll find property with 100% occupancy rate, 0% vacancy, right? So just because they tell you it's 100% occupancy or occupied doesn't mean that's the vacancy rate, okay? So this is like the real income, effective rental income. Now you have to subtract or you have to add other incomes. So late fees, any types of fees that they might put out. RUBS is basically a way of charging back utilities to the tenants. If it's master metered, then instead of the tenants paying for the electricity and gas and water, it gets charged to you, or it gets charged to the apartment owner. RUBS is a way of proportioning it back to the tenants so that they have to pay their own utilities, even though it's not metered at their level. And there's places online you can look it up, and they calculate it out based on the square footage and the number of tenants to try to give a fair amount. What the benefit of that is that by charging it back to them, they will be more careful on their use of electricity and water and gas than if they're not paying for it themselves, right? So all of a sudden those bills start decreasing, and you make more money that way by making them pay for it. Other income could be like laundry and what do you call it? Coke machines or vending machines. So any form of other income goes here. And then after you add your effective rental income and all these other incomes, you come to effective gross income. So that's your entire effective income. And now you're ready to subtract out your operating expenses. Before I go there, let me see what we got in here in the chat. So okay, I'll go, Jay. I'm going to talk about the valuations when we get to that point. We're not quite there yet. What is loss to lease? So the loss to lease, hold on 1 minute. I don't use this very often. Okay, so the loss to lease is what you could have if you use market rents instead of where you're at right now. If you're a sub-market rent, that's the loss to lease. So that shows you how far below market rent you are. So if the actual market rent, you should be pulling in 1.2 mil, but you're only pulling in 700K, you're 43% below market rent, which is a great sign, because that means you can get in there cheaper, raise the rents, raise the income, the NOI, and raise the valuation. And then if you want to flip it or refi or whatever you want to do, it works out great in your favor. So you always want the actual rents, if you can, find them below market. That way you have some value add in there to be able to improve this property's NOI. Great question. Okay, so now heading down, oh yeah, the operating expenses. So you want to put in whatever they have. Maybe they have an operating expense report or some other reporting that shows their expenses. They might just have a pencil and paper, right? Sometimes you get literally things just written out and a photocopy of it or something. And you put in here whatever they give you, right or wrong, just put it in here. And now you can see where it lands. They may not fill all the slots. So, if some of these were not filled, like what I like to do before I actually go and put them in there is I'll take this whole batch here and I'll just delete it so that as I type things in, I'll know which ones I haven't hit yet. So I'll go in here, I'll put in payroll, property insurance, property tax, just fill in anything that they have. And then what you're left with in the end is maybe they left some of these blank, like they didn't have anything for property or for maintenance and repairs. They didn't have anything for, let's say, utilities. So now you want to go back to them and ask them about that. I didn't see utilities. I didn't see maintenance and repairs. Do you have those numbers? And if they say, oh yeah, there was no maintenance and repairs. Yeah, right. The only way there's going to be no maintenance and repairs on a 116 unit building is typically because they're deferring the maintenance to make the numbers look better than they really are. So deferred maintenance doesn't count. You need to have maintenance in your equation. Utilities, there's going to be some form of utilities that the apartment complex has to pay for. Even if the units themselves are individually metered, what about the parking lots? What about the common spaces, right? So try to get everything you can here to come up with the OpEx totals. And you won't get that a lot of time. A lot of times they'll just tell you, yeah, we don't have all that, or my client doesn't have all that. This is what he's got. So once you get that number, you're going to see over here, this OpEx is reflected back from here, and there's going to be an expense ratio. Typically, you can expect the expense ratio to be about 50%. It might be 40, it might be 60, but if it's outside of that range of 40 to 60, then there's probably something wrong. Maybe it's too high, maybe it's too low. Like 77 is super high. So it's like, okay, why are their expenses so high? It could be high because they're mismanaging. They're overpaying. They got way too many staff, or somebody's actually like, fraudulently stealing money, charging things as an expense just to get their own personal car, whatever they're doing, right? But you need to be aware of that. Why is this expense so high? It can be an opportunity. If they're mismanaging and paying way too much for expenses, that's an opportunity to go in and lower expense, which increases your NOI. On the other side, you have the normalized. So what you want to do, these are all with the formulas behind it that give you the normalized number. So if you see a number on normalized that's way different than the actual, it's kind of a cue that something may be off, right? In this case, the normalized is actually higher than the actual. Well, your expense ratio was already too high. So what does that mean? It doesn't necessarily mean your expenses are too high. In this case, the rents were too low, right? So if the pro forma rent, if the rent for the area could actually be much higher, that means that your low rents is going to give you a high expense ratio. Does that make sense? Let me see what we got here in the chat. From where do you get the market rent data? So the market rent data, pardon me, there's a few ways you can get that. You can just go to HotPads, Zillow, for example, and look at apartments, right? Or look at similar units to what you're looking at and try to see what they're going at. If you can't find good enough data, the best way to do it, if you can, is ask a realtor that works with multifamily. They can tell you what the going rate is in that area, but you can do your own homework first and come up with a good idea of what the going rent rate is in that area. So two good ways of getting that data. So if you're, the normalized you can see is actually in the 50% range. So that shows you that the pro forma and the normalized data are, in the ballpark you can probably run with. If you don't have this data, one way that you can reverse engineer, remember 50% is kind of a normal number. So if you have at least what the rent roll is, the rent roll should tell you what all the apartments are renting for, all the units are renting for. If you have that rent roll, you can construct the gross rent. If you don't have the rent roll, it's going to take a conversation. Call them up and go through every unit and reconstruct the rent roll. Now that you've reconstructed that, you get the gross rent up here, and you can plug in what the vacancy, ask them about vacancies, try to get all this information in as much as you can with a verbal conversation if they got no paperwork. And then for the expenses, if you don't have all this information, use the 50% rule. That gives you a number that's at least in the ballpark. It's better to have actual data, but with mom and pop owners, a lot of times you will not have good data. So just use the 50% rule, and then you can use that for your evaluation. Any questions on the income and operating expenses? All right, so we're going to head down to the next section, which is your rehab and valuation. So with the rehab, you got to know your market, and as well as the class. So a class C is going to use cheaper finishes, right? A class A is going to use higher end finishes. So you want to calculate, number one, if this apartment is 116 units, it doesn't mean you're going to have to rehab 116. It may be that half of them were already rehabbed. So units to renovate, this right now equals this, but you can just change it. So if they tell you we've already renovated 80 units and there's only, 36 left to go, just type in 36 here, right? And that'll adjust your number for rehab. As well with your renovation costs per unit, you got to kind of know your market. So again, Memphis, Dallas, way different. Apartments are, an average of 10K per unit. They could be less when you're dealing with a lower end. They could be more with a higher end, as well, depending on your construction in that area. You get to your expensive markets, and the price is going to go up. So keep that in mind. Just tweak this renovation cost per unit to match what reality is. If you don't know, get a hold of somebody in your market that works that market, and they could probably give you a pretty decent number for that. And then you have landscaping, hardscaping, amenities. If you're going to upgrade amenities, maybe you're going to add a laundry, right? A coin laundry. And CapEx, whatever large expensive items you have to put into it. Maybe you got to re-roof the whole thing, right? So you put that into here for CapEx. And then that gives you an entire rehab cost. So when you're evaluating this property, you want to subtract out whatever repairs are required up front. Not the long-term repairs that you're going to be making over time, but anything that needs to be done to make it move-in ready. That's what you need to do up front here in your evaluation. So once you have that, your rehab cost, now you come over to the actual valuation. There's several ways to evaluate it. I put all of them in here. By looking at all of them, you can get a better feel of where the valuation really ought to be. So looking at this, you see the NOI over cap shows you a value of 132K. That's obviously wrong, right? The reason it's wrong is because the expense ratio is so high. And that's simply because mismanagement, they've got, they're charging way under rent, right? So that leads you to and actually let me put this back from an A to a B. That way it matches the pro forma. So now you actually have a negative cap number. So a negative valuation for NOI over cap. Whereas a pro forma, after you fix everything, shows a 7.9 valuation. That's when you change that, you fix the management issues, you lower the expense ratios if you can, you increase your rents, get the property filled properly because it was at 10% vacancy, now you get it to 5. Whatever you have to do to get it running right, that's the pro forma, right? So your NOI over cap for pro forma is 7.9. The GRM calculation says 5.8 mil and 12.3 mil. The 50% rule, remember, that's if you don't have all of this data, you can just say NOI is 50% of your rent. So now the 50% rule shows your current valuation of 4.6 and your end evaluation is 10.2, 10.3. Now this here, that's something that you will plug in. Basically, it's a formula right now, but you can tweak that. It's pointing to this other market comps. The market comps is basically what are the units going for in that area. And again, I would check with a realtor to get a realistic number there. So if you're dealing with a 116 unit apartment building, of the other apartments of similar size, similar class, similar neighborhood, what did they go for? And I should say similar condition. What did they sell for? Were they selling at 45,000 per unit, or were they selling at 100,000 per unit? That's a big difference, right? That changes your evaluation significantly. But let's just say it was 45. They're going at 45. So that would put our valuation at 4 mil. But our 50% rule says 4.6. Our GRM says 5.8. This one you can't even use. So you might go with the 4 mil. You might start with the 4 mil. You might go with the 50% rule. I wouldn't go with the highest necessarily. But one thing about these multifamily properties, you got to know your market, right? How hot is the market? Because if it's a hot market and the property is a good solid investment, they will go higher. They will sell higher than the real evaluation. So keep that in mind. That will help you to see, can I overpay or can I underpay, right? So if you have a market that is not as hot, or maybe there's, the condition of the property, they're not, maybe they're off market and you don't have as much competition, right? If you can get an off market, your competition is lower, then start at the lower end, start at the 4 mil as your evaluation. So the seller price is here, 4.5, and that kind of tells you something. Seller price is 4.5. It's below all these other valuations, right? It's only above your market comp. So if it's set on the market for a month or 2 or 3 already at 4.5, that gives you plenty of room to offer less. And so you might go with the 4 mil as your offer and try to work it there, or you might try lower, right? But this gives you a feel of the area that this evaluation should fall within. There's different ways of doing it. The NOI over cap is the typical way you want to do it, along with the market comps. Both of those are the typical ways. But in this case, when you have a property that's just not managed right, the NOI over cap just simply isn't going to work properly. Any questions thus far? Oh, and by the way, these evaluations have subtracted out the rehab cost. So if the rehab cost, if I make this 0, you'll see all these numbers pop up because it's subtracting out whatever work needs to be done to that property. All right, heading on down. Funding, it's time for some funding. Funding 1 is going to be primarily bank or seller, or seller finance. I am going to add in here a third one, which is a master lease. Master lease is also very common. So it will, I'll adjust this for a third option, but that's going to be your primary funding, whichever one you choose to go with or whatever works out. Seller finance is great anytime you can get it. But there's advantages to each. if you have a lot of repairs, bank financing might be a better option because sometimes you can get funding that includes the repairs, right? Whereas with seller financing, it's typically not going to include the repairs. It's just going to be a reduction of the price. So, and then is it amortized or is it not amortized? So bank is typically going to be amortized. Seller finance could be either way. It's all matter what you work out with the seller. Based on what is chosen here, it's going to tweak these numbers. Bank says 30%, seller finance says 5% down payment. Well, I have no idea what it's going to actually be, right? So if you choose seller finance and you work out a 10% down payment, just change this to 10. Make it match reality. And then you put in, it shows you your loan amount based off of your down payment and the interest rate. Change this interest rate to match reality. And then that'll build, as well as your term length, that'll build your payment for your primary loan. And then you might have a secondary loan. Not always, but you might. So if you have a secondary loan, you change this from none to whatever. And more often than not, the secondary loan is going to be a seller finance. We're going to get down to partners later, but on a multifamily, you might have private money loan, but it's not that common. I put PML down here under investor funding as opposed to a funding tool. So private money is not very common simply because of the way the numbers work. It's really hard to make it money flow with both bank, seller finance and private money. So let's say that you have primary is bank, and then they agree to seller finance the rest. So that's how you can work that to get more of it financed. But one thing to keep in mind is these down here, your loan to value, your yield rate, and your DSCR or DCR, your debt service coverage ratio. This tells you if it's loanable, number one. So if let's say you go to a bank, and I'm going to put none here, the DSCR, if it was at like 1.1, they're probably not going to loan you the money, because that means you're only making 10% more than the debt service. And that means it's a risky loan. So they're not going to loan you the money. 1.6 is great. Sometimes you'll get 1.2, but 1.25, 1.3, 1.4, that's all better, right? It's a safer loan. But again, it's a balance. So let's say you look at your DSCR and you see it's 3. That tells you that you're leaving money on the table. You're not, your loan is, you could loan for a higher number, and that way it basically leverages you higher. So you want to leverage it, not too much that it becomes risky, but not so low that if it's under leveraged, you're just not going to make as much money, because a bank loan will typically be less than what you're going to make on your cash on cash. So if the bank loan is at 7% and you're in cash on cash at 15%, you want to have as much in that bank loan as possible to basically amplify what you're going to make out of that deal. Let me see what we got here. Did you say if it's bank finance, rehab cost is included? What do you mean? So it depends on the loan, right? Every loan is different, but some bank loans will finance not just the cost of the actual purchase price, but also if you outline what projects are going to be put into it to make the spaces livable, rent ready, replace the roof, whatever needs accomplished, then they'll loan you money for those repairs as well as for the purchase price. Does that make sense, Jay? And every loan is different, but that's what you would want to shoot for, is including some of that into the loan. That way there's less money out of pocket. Less money out of pocket typically means that you're going to increase your cash on cash, your IRR, your ROI. Too much out of pocket means it's a risky deal. So you want to have a good balance there. So now moving on to the next set of funding, which is, well, the next section is entry fee and investor funding. Entry fee means after your funding 1 and funding 2, what do you have left that you got to pay out of pocket, right? You got to come up with this money somehow because it was not included in your funding 1 and potentially funding 2. So in this case, I see the entry fee is 1.9 mil. After all said and done, I need to come up with 1.9 mil to make this project work. Both whatever is left of purchase price and whatever is left of rehab, closing costs, acquisition costs, all the stuff that it takes to make this deal happen. So right here, I see arrears. So if there's anything in arrears, you're gonna have to come up with that, right? To make the deal happen. Acquisition fees, that could be going to a broker. Frequently, the broker is paid by the seller, but sometimes in multifamily, you'll see that brokers will go after, for example, apartments that are not listed and they don't want to actually sign up with a broker. But what they'll do is they'll say, I'm not going to pay your fee. You have to get that elsewhere. And then the broker will actually pick it up from the buyer as opposed to the seller. You'll find those, and they're not necessarily a bad deal, but that means you'll have to pay the broker from your pocket instead of the seller's pocket. So also it could be that you found this deal via a wholesaler, right? So that acquisition fee could be from the wholesaler. Closing costs, holding costs. Now, one thing to keep in mind with holding costs is a lot of times with multifamily, banks will want you to keep 6 months of your mortgage payments in an account so that if you run into trouble, you have vacancies or something happens and the money flow isn't there, you're not going to default on your loan. So that would be a separate account specifically for those holding funds. And they do the same thing with like CapEx expenses, maintenance expenses. It's something that they're going to want to see to make sure this is a good deal, that you're setting aside money for these expenses and you're not going to come into a problem. So the holding cost is typically 6 months of your mortgage payment. And then marketing. You might set aside money to get this, once you fix it up, to let people know, hey, come check out these apartments. They're all brand new, fixed up. You know, maybe you're giving concessions, maybe you're spending money on ads, whatever it is you're doing, this is the money set aside for that. That all adds up to your entry fee. Now, how do you get the entry fee? If you don't have it yourself, you want to find it through partners, right? So it could be a PML partner, but I'll show you what happens. Like right now, our DSCR is at 1.63. If I change this to PML, the DSCR goes to 0.98. If you have a below 1 DSCR, that means that your debt service coverage is more than what you're actually making. You're not making enough to pay your debts, right? So that doesn't work. You can't use PML if this DSCR goes too low. I recommend never to have it below 1.25. If it's below that, you're kind of putting yourself at risk. It might work at 1.2. I just personally am a little bit risk avert. So keep that in mind. So partners is typically the best way to come up with that money. It might be through a syndication deal where you have all the legal paperwork in play, and then you go get limited partners, LP, and you and maybe a couple others are acting as GPs, general partners. The general partners are the active partners. They're the ones that go out and put the deal together. They make sure all the repairs are done, the evaluations, everything, all the work. LPs, they don't do any work. All they do is contribute their money, right? And expect a nice return. And the LPs get paid first. They're always the priority, right? And you might have different levels of LPs, but that's how the syndicated deals work. Or you might have something that's, not so formal and not a syndicated deal where you just have some friends and you say, hey, how about you be the silent money partner and I'll be the partner that does all the hard labor, and we're going to make this deal fly. And they agree to it. They contribute the 1.9 mil, and now you've got a deal, right? So they're not forming a debt with you, they're forming a partnership with you so that you have a share. Each of you have a share of the cash flow and a share of the appreciation. So that share, I'll show you that in a second, but that's what an LP or a silent money partner, I just have LP for, it can represent silent money partner as well. It's basically a money partner. They're going to get a share. So right down here, you see LP cash flow share, LP appreciation share. That 80% and 50% can be tweaked. So, GPs getting 20% of the deal is very common. They're going to get part of the deal because they're doing the labor, right? They're putting the deal together, they're executing, they're making sure the deal goes right all along the entire time that they're the asset manager. So 20% of the deal goes to them typically. Appreciation share, that can be negotiated, but in the end, you want to make sure that you have a solid cash on cash, a solid IRR, and a solid ROI. I'll explain what those are in a moment. So that's just to tell you a little bit about LP and silent money partners, how they get paid. So the next thing you want to do is figure out your cash flow. All right, before I get to cash flow, let me see what we got in here. Does the LP have to pay out again if the deal goes negative? Yes, they do. There might be a call. You don't want that to happen. That's not good. When that happens, they'll be called to put in more money, but your chances of working with them again might be next to nothing, right? People don't like it when they're forced to put in more money to make a deal flow than what they're told they'd have to put in. But that's what would need to happen. So cash flow, before you actually calculate the cash flow, before we had the NOI, right? That was the income, the net income, but now you have to subtract out your debt servicing and your capital expense. So the CapEx is not part of the operating expense. It does not go into your NOI. NOI is used for evaluation, is used for taxes, right? It's used for a number of different things that if you put the CapEx in there, it's going to skew it. So it's really supposed to be down here under the, before the cash flow, after the NOI. So you subtract out your different funding, you subtract out your CapEx, and this is just an allotment for capital expenses. If you do a project, you hold this for 10 years or 8 or 7 or whatever you hold it for, and then you sell it, all that money that you accumulated in your CapEx account, it can be brought back into the deal, right? It's not gone unless you actually spend it, it's just set aside. But this is a good number to set aside, $80 a unit. That's based off of these numbers up here. So if you have an older unit, it's going to be a smaller number. A newer unit, older unit is going to be a bigger number. Newer unit is going to be a smaller number for CapEx. Because you can expect if it's older, you're going to have more expenses. Things are going to break, that you're going to have to deal with. So this number will adjust based off of that. Cash flow. So once you subtract out those, you come up with a cash flow. In this case, it's a negative cash flow because we don't have enough NOI to cover everything and make it a positive deal. That's why it ended up being a negative cash flow. So that said, with our current funding arrangements, it doesn't work, right? Now, this is just a sample deal, but if you plug in all your numbers, you typically want to see a positive cash flow. Getting into a negative cash flow apartment can work if it's got good bones and your investors are willing to take on that project. But if it's negative cash flowing, there could be a lot of unseen issues as to why it's negative. So it might scare away some investors, right? Most investors prefer getting into a positive cash flow situation and then increasing the cash flow. But doesn't mean it's a no-go. It can definitely happen if that was the case. And then the 50% rule, cash flow, shows you what you could expect for the 50% rule of expenses. That brings you up to this number right here. So that helps you to see what your income would be on that property to make this work based on these numbers you put in for, you know, the NOI minus your funding, minus your CapEx, gives you your cash flow. Now, the next level up is, this is the money they invested. This is their share, their cash flow share, their appreciation share. That's going to calculate your cash on cash, your IRR, and your ROI. So cash on cash is basically for the amount of money they invested, how much return are they getting on their first year annually. So I put year 2 instead of year 1 because of this particular situation. You can adjust that to whatever year is appropriate. Year 0 is the year you bought it. Year 1 is your first year of flow. And that's required because of the IRR calculation. IRR is kind of like averaging out the amount of money after you exit. So when you exit, you get your appreciation back, right? So the payout is going to be the appreciation or the principal that's in it minus all your costs. But it's like your loans, you got to pay off the loans, right? But it's also going to include the cash flow that you made during that time frame. So if you held it for, let's say, 5 years, your payout might be 4.4 mil, and then your IRR is going to include that 4.4 mil along with all the cash flow that you made during that time that you held it. And then it's going to take that and kind of average it out. It has to do, the formula has to do with the speed of money as well. Money up front is better than money at the end, right? So the IRR formula evaluates it based off of when you get the money, not just how much money you got. It's a complicated formula. I just use the IRR equation built in here to calculate it because it just makes sense to do it that way. And then you come up with your IRR. Typically, you want to have a cash on cash at least 10%, if possible, and an IRR of at least 20%. Now, you might have a skewed apartment. So higher end apartments will typically have lower cash on cash, but a higher IRR. A Class C apartment might have higher cash on cash and lower IRR, right? So depending on the investor, they might prefer one over the other. So if they have a low cash on cash but a high IRR, that's going to be a money shelter for them. They'll get some depreciation and they'll get a good return later. They don't care about the money now because they're all set, but they'll get a nice return later. Versus a high cash on cash, typically investors might start with wanting the cash flow more than the appreciation, but then over time they adjust and they want the appreciation more than the cash flow. And then later on they might adjust and say, you know what, I don't even care if this thing cash flows. I want it for the depreciation. And then that way it saves me a whole bunch of money on taxes, right? So every investor is in his own space, his own growth path as far as what they're looking for. But these are numbers that you want to look at to make sure it's a good deal. You want to have at least a good cash on cash or a good IRR, one or both, right? The ROI basically means a 3x would mean I tripled my money. So if you put in all your numbers and you come up with a 3x ROI, and that's on this says 5 right now because it's on year 5 as an exit plan. If you have a year 5 ROI of 3x, that means that the investors tripled their money in 5 years. That's a great investment, right? So those are ways that you can sell the deal. Now, let's say it wasn't good enough. It wasn't where you want it to be. It's only 1.8x after 5 years. Well, you can tweak this. Instead of them getting 50%, let's see what it is at 80%. So now at 80%, they're getting 16% cash on cash, and they're getting a 2x, I'm sorry, 16% IRR and a 2x of ROI. So that's a better deal for them, right? So sometimes you'll have to give up more of the deal to make it a better deal for the investors. But this is where you would tweak your percentages to make sure the investors have a solid share of the deal. All right, any questions? This is basically the entire multifamily. We've already gone over time, but I'm happy to take questions. I was hoping we could actually like go over somebody's deal, but I've got to go. But I'm happy to take questions before we close out. Anybody? Going once, going twice.
Hey, Rob,
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
are you planning to add a column to see whether we can wrap one of these deals?
To wrap a multifamily.
Yeah, or subject to?
That's
I mean-
interesting. Wrap a multifamily. You know, I never even thought about doing that before. Have you heard of people doing that, Lee? I'm curious.
I've heard like 2 people talking about it, but I haven't seen done it.
Interesting. I'm going to put in here. So let me take a look at that, Lee. and
It's
see-
pretty much getting a mom and pop deal with like very, very low interest.
Yeah,
Then turning around within like a year or so, make it cash flow better, improving it and wrapping it within 2 years.
right. That's it. I never thought about. That's pretty genius. Let me take a look at that and see how I might be able
Because
to.
the reason I'm asking, I'm looking at the deal right now. So that's what I was thinking about. What if I can do this? So I said, who better person to ask is you?
I appreciate that, Lee. But
You're
yeah,
welcome. Maybe I will connect with you later on and we can go over it.
for sure. Yeah, that sounds interesting. My mind is just like contemplating now how that would even work for the numbers, but you know, I love a wrap on a house, and I was just going over it with an investor. That this house actually that I'm closing is for a friend of mine. He's a fix and flipper. They want to get into rentals.
Mhm.
They don't want to hold them for 10 years. They want to hold them for like 5 years.
Yeah,
I told him, you know, if you're only going to hold it for 5 years, why don't you just do a wrap? Why don't you just do a seller finance out?
yeah.
Your numbers are actually stronger doing a seller finance out than just renting, because of, you know, the maintenance and the property management and vacancies and all that stuff.
Yeah,
But yeah, it's you know,
because I'm thinking like, if you get a mom and pop multifamily and it's underperforming and low rents, and you take about a year or 2 years to get it stabilized and improve the value of it,
right.
then keeping it still and turning it around and wrapping it. So
Yeah. So you keep the cash flow going for a while,
absolutely.
and then you get your big paycheck on when the wrap comes due.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's interesting. Cool. Yeah, I'll definitely take a look at that.
thanks.
You betcha. Thanks for the thought. Thanks for thinking of that. Can you please once again explain IRR and COC? So cash on cash, COC, is the simpler of the two. What that is if you're making, I'm going to use round numbers. If you're making $5,000 a year and you have 100,000 into the deal, that's 5%. So that would be a 5% cash on cash. If you're making 10,000 a year and you have 100,000 into the deal, you're making 10% cash on cash. Basically, cash on cash, if you had zero financing in the deal, you did it all straight cash, you did the deal totally cash, your cash on cash would be very simple. If you paid 100,000 for the deal and you put in, and you're making 10K on it, the cash on cash would be 10%, right? But what happens is when you're dealing with loans, typically you can leverage the cash on cash higher by using a loan. So, you know, let's say that you're making 10,000, but you're paying $1 million for the property. By having a loan in place, you can take that 1%, you know, I'm using round numbers, it's not realistic, but you can leverage it higher because now you don't have as much, you don't have $1 million into the deal, you only have 100,000 into the deal, right? So by having less money in the deal, leveraging other people's money, you increase your cash on cash. But that only works if their money is cheaper than what the cash on cash would be. So without their money, let's say you would be making 8%, but then you want to use their money, and their money, it's a hard money loan, and the hard money loan or private money lender wants 12%. Guess what? Your cash on cash goes down. So you want to use a cash on, if your cash on cash would already be higher, maybe it's at 8 and you get a loan for 7, that increases your 8 to maybe 9 or 10. So you want to make sure your loan is at a lower rate than where your cash on cash would be without the loan. Does that make sense? Otherwise, you're just diminishing your cash on cash. T36, I'll explain that in a second. So the IRR is basically a way of taking your lump sums that you get. Maybe you have a lump sum at the beginning, such as in the case of a seller finance or an option fee. And then you have your cash flow in the middle, and then you have a lump sum at the end, your exit, right? That could be your appreciation or whatever it is. So you're taking those lump sums and you're calculating them out and kind of creating an average of those lump sums. So in this case, you have an entry, your cash flow on year 0. Well, I have blanks in here, so it doesn't really show the numbers, but how much money you put into it at the beginning, it's a negative lump sum. And then how much you're making on years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then on year 5, you also have your appreciation as a lump sum exit. It takes all that money and kind of divides it out and says, you know, I'm going to simplify this, but basically it says I'm making 16.7% annually based off of that, right? So it's just a way of spreading your money out to see how good of a return it is. So a 16.7% annual return is better than a 10% annual return, right? So your cash on cash is your annual return, but it doesn't take into account what you put into it, and it doesn't take into account what you're going to get out at the tail end. So the IRR takes all that into account. Any monies that go in or out for the whole time frame gives you your actual IRR and kind of smooths it out, spreads it out over that time frame. I hope that helps. Cash on cash does not include the appreciation. It does include the appreciation, and the refinance amount gets subtracted out from that. So yes, cash on cash includes all that information. You have to subtract out when you get your payout at the end, you have to subtract out what you owe, right? If you owe and you're financing 4 million, your payout is going to be reduced by the 4 million because you got to pay them off, right? Appreciation, maybe the apartment appreciated by 1 million, so that's going to be in there. It does include all that. What is a T36? So a T12, T24, T36 is basically, was that?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. It's your actual rents. It's called trailing 12, trailing 24, trailing 36. Over the course of that many months, what they actually took in on the rents, right? It's more accurate than the rent roll. Rent roll is just like a still picture of where you're at. Whereas the T12, 24, or 36 shows you a timeline of what they received every month, right? So you have an actual, you can see where the vacancies were over time. You can see where they had problems and late fees and all that stuff. It's a better moving picture than a simple rent roll. And so IRR should be greater than COC. Yes, IRR will typically be greater than COC. If it's not, it's bad, right? So if you have an IRR that's lower, maybe your property actually devaluated because of mismanagement or whatever. But a properly run apartment complex should never devaluate. So the IRR should always be above the COC. In a downward market like we are, it can actually lose value, but the majority of it is built off of the rents. So even though home prices are going down, rents are still going up. The only thing that makes it devalue in a market like we're having right now are the fact that the rates for mortgages are going up. So if it's harder to get a loan that actually cash flows, then it's harder to sell properties. If they can't sell properties and they really have to, then they're going to have to lower the price, right? So the raising of the loans, the interest rates, can actually cause multifamilies to devaluate. And if you sold in that circumstance, you could end up with a lower IRR because you lost that appreciation. But the best thing to do is simply hold it through, right? Don't sell if you're going to lose money. You know, as long as you're running the property right and you're not in a horrible neighborhood, a war zone, just hold it until it goes to the right level. The markets always goes up and down, right? But the nice thing about multifamily is they're primarily based off of rents, and rents typically go up. They never go down. Even in a bad market, rents don't go down. So it's a secure investment because of that. All right, guys, I've got to go. I've got a big plate full of food here staring at me, and I got to tell my kids good night. And I appreciate y'all being here, and I hope it was helpful. If anybody needs help on a deal, you know, just shoot me a text. I'm going to put it in the chat here, my phone number. There you go. Happy to help you out and hope it goes. Oh, the YouTube link. Yeah. 1 second here. Let me get that. This silly thing. Your channel. 1 second here. Okay. So here is the link for the YouTube that has all the other ones. You can go to the deal or no deal playlist, and that'll give you the different videos for that. So we have a team, Fat Juicy Deals. You can see as well, there's different trainings for that. We've been growing over the course of the last 6 months in the Fat Juicy Deals and how we're adjusting, modifying for the market. You can also see that. The Fat Juicy Deals is primarily for single family, but we also do multifamily. We've got one deal in the works for multifamily. So if you want to join our team, you know, just shoot me up, let me know, and happy to work with you. Either way, you know, you can. I'm happy to help anybody I can straight through these Zooms. If you want to work with me personally, you want to work with our larger team, that works too. So nice to talk to everybody tonight. I hope you have a good evening. You bet, Lee, Jim. Appreciate all of you. Take care.
Thank you, Ralph.
Thanks, Ralph.
I'll touch base with you later on.
All right.
Good
All
on.
right. Take care.
Enjoy your dinner.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.